Moving into the next session there is Tim Buhler to talk about insuring wood buildings.
Thank you, Dave. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. So you can, if you want to share your screen there while I introduce you, that'd be good.
Absolutely.
So Tim Buhler is the Senior Manager of Market Development Operations for the Woodworks program at the Canadian Wood Council. In the past 15 years at the Canadian Wood Council, he has helped build a network of wood champions and experts throughout North America to promote the use of timber in the built environment. Tim's extensive knowledge in the industry comes from dozens of technical conferences, tours, meetings, and workshops across North America and Europe. Tim has been involved in over 200 timber construction projects in Ontario, including assisting with the development of several alternative code solutions for tall timber buildings. Tim has been leading the Insuring Timber initiative with Canadian Wood Council since 2019. The goal of this program is to ensure more attractive rates for insurance can be achieved for builders of timber projects in Canada. Tim's diligence in pursuing the understanding of the insurance market has helped us grow from a small research project to a national initiative. It has led to collaborations with the United Kingdom Structural Timber Association, the United States Woodworks Wood Products Council, and Laval University. Tim currently chairs a national working group to address the differential in insurance and is a contributor to numerous other committees in the industry examining this issue. So Tim, I'll pass it over to you and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And great presentation, Dan, and really helpful to the understanding of some of the issues that we can talk about in the insurance side. Really great technical overview of timber construction. That is one of the major issues that we'll get into today. So I'm just going to quickly talk about CWC and why this particular project is important to us, the history of the Insuring Timber project and campaign, what conclusions that we've brought about to date, what's the real problem, and how do we go about solving it, and then leave everyone with some best practices and solutions to move forward. So as Dave mentioned, my name is Tim Buhler, and I'm with Canadian Wood Council's National Woodworks program. That particular selfie, it happens to be on just in front of the world's tallest timber building in terms of stories, up until about a couple of weeks ago when the Ascent building in Milwaukee topped out, but that's the 24-story Ho-Ho building in Vienna, Austria. And I highlighted that because it's important to understand what possibilities exist with timber construction, and to be stalled up on things like insurance for low to mid-rise buildings shows that we're kind of living in the past a little bit. I mean, timber has evolved very quickly in the last 10 to 15 years that we'll kind of overview throughout the presentation. But it's important to note that we're certainly able to build many types of buildings out of timber that were not previously even considered as an option. So Canadian Wood Council represents the Canadian wood products industry through a National Federation of Associations, and we act as Canada's unified voice for the wood products industry on the structural side. And our mission is to expand market accessing, increase demand for Canadian wood products through excellence in code standards, regulations, and education out of our Ottawa office. But we have a regional woodworks program, which essentially acts as the marketing department for timber construction. And they range from coast to coast. BC, Alberta, Ontario operate in Sécobois, as Sécobois in Quebec. And of course, the Atlantic team who's hosting us today. We assist in project support, which is the primary role of our technical advisors like David and Vince and in the Atlantic region and others throughout the country. We offer one-on-one technical support through project meetings, site visits, things of that nature. But we also offer up tech calls, help desk program, and present to all types of different stakeholders, all the way from design teams to communities to government, to really put wood at the forefront. I mean, you know, Dan had a great point on you can't even present a timber option to highway bridges and things of that nature. So we need to continue to talk to these types of groups to really bring about some change in the way that wood is perceived and the way that wood is presented as a construction material. We do that by producing technical resources for those design teams to really let them understand how the codes work. I mean, things like the wood design manual are pretty commonplace. CSA 086, obviously the engineering standard for timber construction. We bring publications of case studies to highlight specific building typologies to let you know that these types of buildings are being done and done well. And a new thing that we've been doing in the last 5+ years are publishing code references. As we all know, in the design community, the building code can be cumbersome at times. So we've undertaken the task of highlighting specific areas when codes change to really let you know what's possible in the new area, the timber construction. The one on the screen there was for Ontario's 2015 change to allow up to 6 stories. And we're currently working on different highlights of the upcoming 2020 National Building Code, which allows up to 12 stories of encapsulated mass timber construction, which has already been adopted in regions of British Columbia and Alberta, and hopefully in Ontario sooner than later, and other regions, of course, and specific guides for specific building types. So I want to highlight our technical resources because Canadian Wood Council focuses on making it easier to build with wood, making it more mainstream to build with wood, which brings about why we decided to focus a little bit on the area of insurance for timber construction. Now, up until, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago, I mean, it's not new. This is not a new problem. Insurance rates for timber construction always been a little bit harder to come by, a little bit higher than other rates, which we'll dive into deeper. But as codes have changed to allow up to 6 stories in most of Canada, and alternative solutions for tall timber, and larger institutional buildings being considered more often with materials like glulam post and beam with CLT, NLC, etc. This impact is starting to become a little bit more prevalent. And we can kind of look at that in a couple of slides. But usually when we think about the insurance industry, we think about our cars and our homes, things of that nature. But you can insure just about anything out there. And our specific focus will be on an area of insurance called builder's risk, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But just wanted to give a little overview on the insurance industry itself. Number one, I highlighted hard market. And what that means, insurance does not mirror other markets, but has its own cycle of market fluctuation between what's known as a hard market and a soft market. When markets are soft, rates are low and competitive, profits are high, and companies become a little bit more open to taking risk. But when markets are hard, the opposite is true. Even prior to the never-ending COVID-19 pandemic, insurance markets were entering a hard cycle. The world has changed in terms of climate disasters, in terms of risk levels. So the market was already paying out a lot more than it was used to due to things like hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. So the fact that COVID-19 came along made it even worse. So unfortunately, the hard market is just a reality. So insurance rates are already higher than they typically would be. Obviously, this is a cycle and we'll come back around, but I'm sure most of us have noticed that insurance is a little bit higher despite everyone having, good driving records and things of that nature, and not really driving anywhere, at least around Ontario. But in terms of the actual key players and the number of insurance, so we're all familiar with insurance brokers. Those are the commission-based businesses with the goal of selling policies to builders and other policy holders. This is where you get your car insurance, and this is what most of us typically deal with, and the kind of buck stops there, and that's all we really need to know when it comes to insurance. Some brokers are employees of large insurance companies and represent them at a local level, but others are independent companies who will interact with several insurers. So in terms of brokers, there's thousands. In terms of actual insurance companies, there's dozens. There's not that many in throughout the world. And these brokers deal with what's called an underwriter. And an insurance underwriter will evaluate and analyze the risk involved in insuring people and in assets. And these underwriters are very important to this process of improving the ease and cost of getting insurance for timber buildings. They establish the pricing, they use specialized software and what's called actuarial data, which we'll get into later, to determine the likelihood and magnitude of risk. So these are really who we've been talking to a lot to get that right information in front of them when it comes to the actual risks of insuring timber buildings. So those are the key players. There's actually other companies called reinsurers who insurers use to mitigate their risk, but we don't need to get too complex. So you have your broker who you'll buy your policy from, but they speak to underwriters in going about determining their rates. So what we're talking about today very specifically is builder's risk insurance, which is a specific type of insurance that you would buy during the course of construction of a building to really cover your investment if something were to go wrong during the construction, if there were an unfortunate fire incident, if there was a structural collapse, something of that nature would cover the investment of the building. Now, the issue that we're looking at with insurance is that, number one, there's a lack of capacity for timber construction. And what that means is that a company portfolio, think of a pie chart, would put a large slice of that pie towards low risk, high return type of policies. So they want to guarantee that they're making money, but they will take on higher risk areas in order to make a little bit more potential return. But in terms of insurance, that payout ratio can be higher, so it's considered riskier. And unfortunately, and I'll get to it in the next slide with classification, timber in terms of construction is classified on the very high end of risk. So they only set aside a certain amount of policy coverage for timber, and that lack of capacity is becoming a problem. So say you have a $50 million project of a development of some type, and your insurance company is only willing to cover $5 million of that. Well, then you have to go to 10 insurance companies to cover the cost of your build, which can become a very cumbersome process, which is known as a subscription basis. And the problem with the subscription basis, if you go to, say, 10 companies, then company 10 offers a rate that's twice as high as companies 1 through 9, then companies 1 through 10 will use the rate of company 10. So you're always going to pay on the high end instead of people coming down to match the lower rate. So that's a bit of an issue. We have what we consider classification problems of dumping everything that's related to wood construction into one bucket, which, I mean, mass timber is much different than light wood frame, and multi-story light wood frame is much different than one-story light wood frame. And this comes around because of a lack of data and understanding. Historically, we've built residential 1 to 3 story in this country. The capture of market share in wood is 98+%. So there's thousands and thousands, millions of buildings that bring about the data, but they're all usually residential or small one-story buildings, which we'll get into later, but it's a very different type of construction. So that's where that data comes around. And as a result of this, the rates for timber construction can be 5 times higher or more for that combustible construction. I want to just stress, like, in terms of the overall project budget, it's still, 1 to 1.5%. But I understand for the fact that, especially for private developers, this can be a big chunk of the profit margin. So we really want to, number one, bring about more capacity for timber construction so that people can get these rates, but also bring those rates down into on par with steel and concrete, because, as Dan mentioned, we can achieve similar fire resistance ratings. We're resistant to a lot of things that affect those structural materials. And when done properly, these buildings are extremely safe. I mean, everything that we're talking about is either within the building code or meets the equivalency of the building code. So the fact that it's labeled as higher risk, sometimes that can be a misnomer. And really, we want to talk about this because it affects every construction project, whether it's a single family home all the way up to, multi-story heavy timber buildings. So in terms of classification in insurance, there's 6 classifications. Frame is where everything wood fits under. So it's exterior walls of wood, basically, and the various claddings, etc. And then it goes through joisted masonry, non-combustible, masonry non-combustible, modified fire resistive, and fire resistive. And there's various nuances to this, but in Canada, at least, we almost never, I haven't seen any particular areas where the wood has changed its classification. But speaking to some colleagues in the United States, that they've actually put some mass timber buildings with encapsulation into that modified fire resistive category, because they were able to show to the insurer that they achieved a 3-hour fire resistance rating. So it's important to note that there is some potential, and we've been working closely with insurance companies to move into that potential for modified fire resistive, and maybe even change classifications during construction, but lots of potential there. But right now it's wood is wood, and that's all you get, unfortunately. So as I mentioned, we kind of took a deep dive into this in the last few years. It's not a new thing. It's been around, for many, many years, but we undertook some fact-finding missions through consultants and produced a number of in-depth reports that you can see on the screen there. And if anyone's interested in reading a little bit about the past history, it's some interesting stuff, and we've built on that to make our own conclusions on how it looks today. But we thought it was going to be pretty easy, just a lack of education for the industry on safety and fire resistive elements, char rates for mass timber, like Dan went through, but not necessarily the truth. So we reviewed the information, consolidated it. I familiarized myself with it and began to communicate with some stakeholders, hired a consultant to assist with some of the work, and started implementing those recommendations, those reports. We have a dedicated section on our CWC website that you can jot down there. We can share that with you as well, where we continue to update all the information that we have, and begin collaborating internally and externally with different stakeholders and the insurance industry. And then we began to take the next steps. So how do we build on these reports? How do we make partnerships for success? What can we do to bring about best practices? You start to ask people, you had, an unfavorable insurance rate. Well, what did you do differently? Did you do anything differently? Did you shop around, or did you just, swallow that pain pill and hope for the best next time? I mean, we have to look at it differently than just seeing it as a problem. We can make changes. We started a Canadian working group as well to get insights from across the country. David and Vinny sit on that. In the Atlantic region, it's, maybe not necessarily a huge problem, but it can certainly cut into that profit, as we mentioned, and especially in Ontario and British Columbia, where we're seeing larger budget demonstration projects, that insurance can certainly really be a big portion of that budget and become difficult to come by in terms of that capacity, as I mentioned. So not only is this a pan-Canadian issue, it is a worldwide issue. So we've collaborated with the United Kingdom and their Structural Timber Association, which is I call it the Canadian Wood Council equivalent. And they took a deep dive in this, and we looked to Europe for guidance, the understanding that they were much further ahead in the adoption of mass timber and insurability. However, not necessarily the case, although there's many more projects in the Germany, Austria, UK area. They still have that same issue and adverse nature to risk. Very big problem in the United States as well, although some companies have moved forward in expanding their capacity. But the US has a dedicated rep working on this as well, with some great white papers and resources on their website as well, if you want to do some deeper diving. Industry is a key assister in this as well. There's different approaches to it that we've seen. I just highlighted a company called Barrier Tech, and they produce intumescent coatings, and they determined that to be the solution to insurance issues during construction. We don't necessarily want to promote the fact that wood needs to be coated, because it doesn't. But that is one solution in the interim, and they produce some really interesting promo material around that. Encapsulated the EMTF-DT, or encapsulated mass timber fire demonstration test, that we had a small pilot of that in British Columbia last June, on a larger scale happening in June of this year in the Ottawa area. These types of tests showing the char rates that Dan mentioned and other safety features in larger timber buildings are just really important to get in front of fire officials, insurance officials, and others to show them how these buildings perform. I know there's a large inventory of these tests already, but seeing it in person and as it happens has a big impact. We continue to speak to builders who have a large inventory of mass timber buildings, and the BC's FII, or Forest Industry Investment, has also dedicated some resources to this. And the insurance industry itself has been relatively helpful to it. I mean, they're a knowledgeable industry. We thought they knew nothing about timber construction, but many of these companies have taken deep dives and really understand how these systems work. But getting it in front of the broker sometimes is a little bit trickier. The IBC, or Insurance Bureau of Canada, has been a great partner in collaborating with us and reviewing some of our materials to make sure that it is relevant. And AXA XL and Zurich are two of the large insurance companies that have put out specific capacity for timber construction, upwards of $50 million. And we continue to try to talk to Verisk, or ISO, Insurance Services Office, who are the body that implements those 6 classifications that I alluded to earlier. So we're trying hard to see what we need to do to change how timber is perceived. So we launched the campaign and called it Insuring Timber, with the goals of engagement, education, and rolled out a Did You Know campaign on various social media channels, which was pretty successful. Just some facts that and mythbusters type of thing that led to, for us, really good engagement on our social channels, and brought about some great contacts, which allowed us to move further down the road in terms of education, again, promoting what we had on our website, and through a preliminary report that I put together with some consultant help called Insuring Timber, that highlighted the key areas and what we plan to do to address them, and continue to engage with industry through specific project meetings, which led us to the thought about how to take the next steps. And having developed a bit of an inventory of wood-friendly insurance companies, we put together a very in-depth insurance think tank with the companies that you see below. It was a full-day interactive session where we spoke to underwriters, to brokers who are very familiar with wood construction, got their opinions, went in there with no preconceived notions, as did the insurers, on nothing was off the table, so to speak, in terms of addressing this issue. So it was extremely helpful and brought about the following conclusions. Number one, we need to raise conceptions, both as the wood industry and as the insurance industry. Maybe you know everything about timber construction, maybe you don't, and vice versa. But the insurance company's big three concerns are that capacity that we mentioned, still very risk averse into taking on larger policies because of the unknowns and misconceptions around timber construction. And the biggest unknown and misconception is the repair and remediation. That meaning, during construction, if there's a small compartmentalized fire, how do we repair the CLT or the lightwood frame structure? Can you repair it? Is the building a total loss? Because that's what most policies assume when it comes to timber construction, that if there is some type of damage event, that the building will be a total loss. Whereas something like a $10 million building built out of wood, the payout will be $10 million. But perhaps a similar event to repair a concrete building, the payout on that would be $1 million. A lot of unknowns there. There are some more and more resources coming around to addressing repair and remediations. Our partners at Innovations and NRC are really looking into this, as well as the US. And there are some videos and best practices already out there on repairing CLT and other timber components. So more information is needed. And I think the kind of interesting thing about that is when it comes to mass timber, there's very, very few examples of damage occurring during construction where it had to be repaired and remediated. So, speaking to insurers, it wasn't that a good thing? And it is. However, they don't have the data to make accurate conclusions. So as time goes on and this continues to be the norm where there are not issues during construction, then we can certainly use that as leverage. It's a very safe way to build, which it is. In the short term, in phase 2 activities, we continue to be able to make referrals to some of those friendly companies and continue to hold different workshops with stakeholders and presentations to industry like this one. And the development of a best practices guide, which we'll talk about in a second, to bring about a more friendly application for insurance. And in the long term, we continue to make partnerships and rate reductions. So we talked about these misconceptions earlier, and Dan alluded to some that, it's going to rot, or it's vulnerable to termites. That's the problem, right? Those termites are going to eat the building and it's going to collapse during construction or after. That's a real problem, but that's not it. That the wood rots, and that's the issue. If it gets wet, it's done. Like you might as well throw the building out. But that's a real problem, but it's not. Okay, well, maybe it's fire. That's the issue. Wood's vulnerable to fire. That's the issue, and if we can solve that, it's all good. But it's not true. The real problem when it comes to insurance is risk. And for now, timber is perceived as risky, and I mean we'll get into it in a few slides. But in terms of historical data, you can't necessarily blame insurance for perceiving it that way. Risky business for insurance is not a good thing. So that's why we put together a guideline for insuring timber in Canada. Building with wood is a lot different than it was 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Prefabrication, modular construction, mass timber, these things did not exist. Like, Dan's presentation mentioned glue lamp, post, and beam. And, I've been around the industry long enough that it used to be called heavy timber or glue lamp construction before that mass timber tagline came along. So the structural systems have changed. It's unfamiliar. There's a lack of data. Everyone thinks that wood is wood. Our wood framing methods are largely standardized throughout North America, with the quality of the lumber, the spacing of the studs, types of lumber use is they vary little between the types of buildings. Assemblies to achieve fire resistance ratings and sound transmission ratings are largely similar. But multi-story wood buildings and mass timber buildings, the assemblies are complex. They meet and exceed building codes. They vary widely in grid spacing, component sizing, connections, mechanical, electrical integration, all very different from building to building. So these structural systems are not cookie cutter that we're used to seeing in some smaller lightwood frame or non-combustible types of construction. So it's important to clearly identify in your structural system what is being used, how you are achieving the desired structure. I mean, when people we've talked to in insurance hear of a wood structure, a 6-story mass timber building, they think everything from the floor assembly to the building envelope is all wood, that there's no concrete topping, that there's no non-combustible envelope, that there's no non-combustible core. You have to talk about what you're using in the assembly to protect it from fire resistance, the sprinkler systems being used, things of that nature. How you're achieving, multi-hour fire resistance ratings through CHAR, not something that's common knowledge throughout insurance and even throughout construction. So when you're taking the steps of, for now in the short term, experience is an asset. Are you using architecture, engineering, construction teams that have an inventory of timber buildings under their belt that can explain what they're doing and how they're doing it, which works well, especially in mass timber, implementing integrated design teams or IPD, integrated project design, from the get-go. Get your timber suppliers, engineer, architect, builder working together from the very beginning, and work with the insurer from the start of the project, coordinating that building system and giving detailed explanations. If you can share your modeling and construction drawings with the insurance company, it goes a long way. And in the long term, we can continue to build larger database of projects. We at Woodworks are tracking more and more 5- and 6-story lightwood frame, larger institutional buildings using lightwood frame and mass timber, and our ongoing changes to the building code in terms of multi-story and larger footprints continue to help, because if those authorities holding jurisdiction are confirming that they're allowing this in the building code, it continues to prove that it's a safe and viable construction type. And luckily for us, because this is a relatively new type of construction, we have many demonstration projects that are proven success stories with lots of information behind them to draw from, including fire safety plans, including moisture management plans that have been implemented. So just continue to share that info, and it goes a long way to alleviating the concerns of the insurer. The construction site is key, and this is where I alluded to, you wonder why rates are high. I'm about to show you. The site is the root of the problem. This is where risk happens. This is based on historical data throughout history of on-site built buildings where, you know, risk is not something that is even in the back of anybody's mind. We can change things like that. And even today, going through a subdivision near my home, which I won't identify, but this is not uncommon, where you see end cuts sitting in puddles of water piled up, like, you know, it looks like a campfire waiting to happen. Why is this even occurring on a construction site? I think somebody asked a question about rain being on falling on wood. You know, wood can get wet as long as it's allowed to dry and properly detailed. As you know, we just saw, you can use these in bridges that last for hundreds of years if you design it properly. But leaving these risky types of materials just lying about doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, you've got a full bin here. This is on a Sunday, so it's sitting there over the weekend, open lid, risk waiting to happen. You know, you've got your studs sitting in sand with a lot of moisture. Well, just simply, you know, putting these off the ground would make a big difference. Having some safety on your site goes a long way, instead of just leaving your materials about. Something like this, just simple construction fencing, you know, it looks a lot cleaner here than it does in the other example. And here's a example of something like a very clean site. This is a mass timber build where these prefabricated components really eliminate a lot of risk, because it arrives on site precisely cut, much like, you know, your kit of parts of Lego. You just assemble it together, reduce crew sizes. The more people on site, the riskier it gets. Reduce end cuts. There's no waste happening here, so you don't have to remove things like garbage and whatnot on a daily basis, because there is very little waste and very precise building components coming together in a very short amount of time. So in the short term, in terms of construction site safety and security is paramount. I mean, sometimes that's difficult on smaller sites to have the security that you need, but on larger building sites, it's certainly something that we need to address. What are you doing with your sprinklers on site? If your building is sprinklered, how fast are you getting them in? It should certainly be at the top of the list. I have an example of an Ontario project that there was an unfortunate fire. Luckily, the building was not occupied, but the building was completely framed in October, and the fire occurred in February. This is a 5-story building required to be sprinklered, and it could have been activated in October, but the building burnt down in February as they were doing the finishing work inside, and the sprinklers weren't activated yet. Months later, the water and whatnot was all hooked up, so it could have been the first step and maybe, you know, prevented that risk from happening. Having things like a site foreman and site check-ins and outlining that on your insurance plan can go a long way. And in the long term, it's changing the way that we do things on site, eliminating things like end cuts and whatnot all over the place, having more prefabrication where you can build things in a factory controlled environment, and even going one step further into modular, where everything is completely installed, including mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and just slipped together in no time on site. And we've been looking into that as well, as if the more prefabricated components that we have, will that go about reducing the policy? Something to be determined. And of course, fire safety is high on the list as well, with that wood is wood mentality, and the fact that people think that perhaps it's a total loss if there were a fire event. And something to note too is if you have a multi-story building, say it's 2 stories of wood on top of 4 stories of concrete. Right now, combustible is the default. So even though there's more concrete construction, the entire project will be insured as if it was completely made out of timber. So that's another area to continue to discuss with the insurance world. That are hybrid buildings really the same, and should they be treated the same as other building types? So that's the default right now. and continued misconceptions around fire resistance, we can achieve those 2 to 3 hour fire resistance ratings and are required to according to building codes. Right now, the steps you can take is again explaining the system and what best practices that you're doing, explaining your fire safety plan. And that's a key thing that you should have on a large construction plan. Have that fire safety plan, have distributed copies to everyone who's working on site. Companies like CHM, like Stephen Kraft, who'll be presenting later today, all those fire consultants can prepare those plans for you and do so in terms of alternative solutions and even code compliant areas. They can produce that and have many templates for it. So something to think about. And in the long term, the Structural Timber Association that I alluded to, they have programs where you register the site if there is a timber construction happening. It's registered with the local fire department, it's registered with other authorities, and they actually do random inspections to make sure that the site is functioning as it should to a high level of safety. Sprinkler requirements, continue to make sure that those are a high priority. And as building codes change in the long term, the greater the adoption, the more stringent these codes become, the safer these buildings will be during construction. And along with fire safety, a large concern is water and moisture. In fact, the top 3 claims for insurance, number 1 is fire. Number 2 is structural collapse, which blew my mind that number 2 amount of claims are from buildings falling down, which, I mean, a lot of structures aren't built with timber, but I mean, what kind of best practices are we working with in construction that more buildings are collapsing than are being damaged by water and things of that nature? So lots of improvement to make in all terms of construction. But yeah, so fire, we can address that. Water and moisture is a little bit trickier. Surprisingly, this is not a rain issue. Most insurance policies assume that some type of rain will occur and that the builder is taking the appropriate steps to ensure that the timber dries, just as we mentioned before, that making sure that the timber is allowed to dry. It can get wet, just don't encapsulate it when it is wet. Make sure that it is allowed to dry. Get that roof on as soon as possible. Temporary tenting over timber components is a good practice that you see in Europe a lot, not so much in Canadian examples. This project site tour I did in Vancouver, downtown Vancouver, where God knows how much that lot cost, but it was a CLT build, and it was using, in some areas, 9-ply CLT, which, as those of us in the industry know, that's a lot of fiber, and fiber is where your cost comes from, that were sitting in puddles unwrapped. Very simple steps to take. Most of these things arrive on site wrapped. If you just keep them out of water until they're installed, or have them arrive just in time for assembly, goes a long way. So have that moisture management plan. Again, I mentioned it's not rain that's a concern. It's things like, what if a pipe bursts behind a wall, or what if the sprinklers get set off automatically? So are you talking about your concrete toppings? Are you talking about whatever membranes you're using on top of the timber assembly to protect it from water? Things like floor drains in areas such as kitchens or bathrooms can go a long way to mitigating risk. And in the long term, we hope that this leads to standardization of best practices, certain mandates and understanding, and even things like misting sprinklers in wood buildings, which use far less water, but are in some tests as effective as at extinguishing fire, can go a long way to helping dry out that area post type of disaster event. And again, the repair and rehabilitation, a lot of lack of data there, very few claims, but we continue to look at doing testing with some of our partners and publishing those results. Again, FP Innovations and others are looking into that, as well as NRCan. So hopefully we can see some great reports there, and a few resources are available on our website. But in the short term, like, talk strategies with your builder. What, does your mass timber supplier suggest doing in case of an event like that? Can they supply a replacement panel? How do you go about replacing it? Is there a supply chain issue if your order arrives and one of the components is damaged? Are you at the top of the list for replacement? Just kind of ticking off those boxes goes a long way to mitigating some risk there. So in the long term, we need more testing, we need longer term strategies, and we need examples of best practices in action. And finally, in terms of insurance insight, what are we dealing with when it comes to companies? Are you a builder who traditionally does non-combustible, and you're looking to get into the timber world, but you're using the same company that has never insured a timber building before? It's not a great practice. You can shop around, you can talk to companies who are familiar, who are advertising themselves as wood friendly, which do exist, and we can help make those connections. And in the short term, we can follow our best practices and select the right brokerage and manage building precedents. When you go in and you're talking about what you're building, I mentioned the Ho building in Austria and the Milwaukee Ascent Tower. And those are great for terms of publicity around the building. But an insurer told me is the biggest mistake you can make when you're going to apply for insurance is leading with something like that. It's like, oh, I'm building the first mass timber building in Atlantic Canada. Their eyebrow is raised right away. What do you mean that's the first one? I want to be building the 100th one, or insuring the 100th one, so I know that it's safe. So build your body of work, find precedences, even if it's not in the same geographical area. Insurance generally looks for a similar project in a 50-kilometer radius as to where you're building your building. So that's very difficult to find, even in places like British Columbia. A lot of examples of similar typologies to mass timber or multi-story wood. We're getting better and better as time goes on, but continue to look at that body of work. The WoodWorks programs can certainly help you identify examples. Speak to different insurance companies. Speak to building departments. Ask them what they've seen in your area, because that can be helpful to supply that information to insurance. And we ask for people who are interested in this and helping us make a difference is to be part of the larger conversation. We do remove as many roadblocks as we can when it comes to timber construction. Previously, that's been code restrictions. Sometimes it's supply chain issues. Sometimes it's capacity of the manufacturer issues. But insurance can become one of those. And as more and more mandates come along for greener construction, for carbon neutrality, for reduction of embodied carbon, we don't want to have somebody interested in timber construction and then present them with roadblock after roadblock after roadblock until they give up. You want to make it as easy as possible. Codes are helping to do that. You can see where we're headed with up to 12 stories in encapsulated mass timber. Fingers crossed that they're even looking into expanding that from Group C and Group D occupancies into Group A occupancies and other types of buildings to include that stories of encapsulated mass timber. And Canada is a leader in this type of construction. The US now allows for 18 stories in mass timber construction, and they use the Brock Commons building in Vancouver as a template for a successful example. So a building that exists in Canada was used to change codes in another country, but hasn't yet been successfully changed up to 18 stories here in Canada. So we can continue to talk to AHJs and others to really change the tune and the perception of timber construction. It's a lot easier to find examples now, which is great. And I think the most important thing to highlight, and Dan mentioned it as well, is that we need to be looking at sustainability in a larger sense. You know, he did a great job of explaining how we can sequester that carbon in our buildings, but those younger trees that we replace take that carbon out at a much greater rate than older trees do. And we're not using those you know, beautiful growth trees that you see in the previous slides to make these types of buildings. And a little known fact that I stumbled upon, which is very interesting, is that companies who've been using timber for building purposes and follow sustainable forestry message that increase their sawmill output actually increase forest coverage because of how rigorous sustainable forestry practices are. So, I mean, this is a big solution to some of the climate change problems out there. The European nations such as France, Amsterdam, and now UK have all identified timber construction as a viable way to reduce carbon emissions and increase the amount of carbon taken out of the atmosphere. There's been some allusion to it in some states reports from the US, and even here in Ontario, mass timber construction was recently mentioned in some government reports as viable and sustainable ways of building. So that concludes kind of what I wanted to talk about. Big thank you to all the CWC members and the Woodworks funders and partners. And I think I did leave a few minutes for questions on this topic. But again, you know, it's something that continues to be a work in progress. And there are some short-term solutions, but in the long term, all we do is build more timber construction and we'll get there. But we'd like to speed that up a little bit if possible.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And we will open the floor to Q&As. I think we got just a little over 5 minutes left before we start the awards video. So again, same as the last presentation. If you have any questions, please type in the Q&A section down below. And I believe the link for the CE credits is in the chat box as well.
If you want to download to the best practices guide is available on our website in English and in French for anybody who's interested in taking a read through that. It was vetted by a number of insurance companies and the Insurance Bureau of Canada as a viable method. And there has been some anecdotal references that if we continue to do these types of things and you're following a checklist, that it could become a standardized practice to, as long as you follow these steps, they won't really ask too many more questions, which would be great to see. It really would make the process a lot less cumbersome.
I got a question for you here. It was sent to me in the chat. In the past, heavy dimension timber was provided for reduced fire premiums. When I started out my career in the 70s, what's the status of that statement today? Great talk, by the way.
Great question. And, you know, we've alluded to that before, is that when speaking to insurance companies, is that, you know, it's not a new type of construction. There's many examples of post and beam, solid sawn buildings with NLT floors in multi-stories throughout many areas in Canada. But as of right now, heavy timber, solid sawn, and mass timber, although very similar in properties in terms of insurance, are not considered the same thing. So we cannot use that historical data to as precedent for the type of construction that's used today. Although most of the time the mass timber alternative in sizes actually has a greater fire resistance rating, they say, well, it's different and we don't know how to calculate that. So, but yeah, great question. I mean, since heavy timber is recognized in the building code, there can be some reduction in rate there, but unfortunately the mass timber doesn't fall in that area at this time.
You hear me, David and Tim?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
It's interesting. I know you got 2 or 3 minutes left. I can remember one time before with a heavy dimension timber, you saw some of my buildings there in my presentation, and it was neat to follow you along, Tim, with what you're talking about. But I can remember us getting into a scrap with a big building we had to design back in the late 70s, early 80s, where we actually put forward in the presentation steel structures that had been under low heat fires, and showed them how the steel structures expanded, blew the joints out, and the building collapsed. And then compared with that, heavy dimension timber buildings that had been through a fire, charred, stayed intact, up, and they were walnut shell blasted and reused to build a building. And that really brought home the message, and that resulted in a different fire insurance scheme. I think we need more of that. I think we need more, fact is stranger than fiction most of the times, and there's perception of stick built and the fire ratings of stick built that kind of get transferred over to heavy dimension timber, and it's a bad rap, so to speak, if you know what I mean. It's apples and oranges.
Absolutely.
When we get these heavy dimension timbers, they char, shut down ignition, and the building stays intact. It doesn't blow out the joints. So I think it takes a cohesive and a marketing effort, and this is where CWC plays such an important integral role, because engineers and manufacturers and suppliers are seen as biased. They're seen as vested interest, if you know what I mean, Tim, when I say that. And when you take a quasi-government body who has no vested interest other than promoting a overall marketplace, they get a better ear. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And then
Absolutely.
Bring a proper literature search to bear. When I got my PhD, they would have hammered the crap out of me had I not done a proper literature search and actually picked out the facts, if you know what I mean. Not hearsay, but the facts. And that's what we really need in this case, is the facts presented to the industry, the insurance industry, because a lot of what they go with is stick-built mentality.
100%. And I mean, make a lot of great points there. I didn't include in this presentation, but there's that great photo that you've seen. I'm sure we've all seen something similar, of a heavy timber beam with the steel equivalent melted around it.
Exactly.
While it remains standing.
Exactly.
And oftentimes it's the steel connection that fails in the fire before the timber itself does. So,
why we embed steel connections.
Exactly.
Yeah, I showed you the picture of the one in Vienna that I designed. That was whole part of it. We put everything inside the beam. Who could imagine that we have to protect the steel from fire when the insurance company says, I'm going to surcharge you a premium because you're building with wood. Build with steel and I'll give you a cheaper one, yet we're protecting steel with wood. I mean, it's an amazing thing that you have to kind of synthesize out. Thanks, Tim.
Absolutely. Thank you.